has questions.
Just in relation to the Northern Australia Infrastructure Facility, that I understand your department has the carriage of from various inquiries that I've made during the course of the week. Can you tell me whether the Department of Infrastructure had any input into the facility before it was announced? Did you brief them or involve them in the process of policy development?
Yes, Senator.
Okay, because I established, or rather my colleague established, that Infrastructure Australia had not been so involved. So I'll just double check whether you made any forays to Infrastructure Australia to brief them or involve them.
I think I'd have to check.
Okay.
But I don't quite remember. We may have, but I'd be inclined to say no, but we'll take it on notice.
Thank you. If you could take that on notice, that's lovely. So can you tell me where the idea originated? Did it start with your department? Did it start with infrastructure? Where was the genesis of it?
So it was part of the policy development.
I beg your pardon?
It was part of the policy development, and it's a government decision. I don't know that we can really add too much more to that.
Okay, was it your department that was working on that, or the PM, or?
It came through the Northern Australian White Paper process, Senator.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, so when did you start working on the facility? How proximate to budget night was the work that you were doing, Mr. White?
So the Northern Australia White Paper process has been going for a long time, Senator. Mm-hmm. The Green Paper came out last year. Mm-hmm. There have been a number of infrastructure issues and proposals come along through that through that process, and this is where that came from.
Sure, but the actual creation of the facility is a new announcement from budget night. When
Yes.
did you start working on that new aspect of what has been a long process?
I wouldn't know exactly when, Senator, but earlier this year.
Okay, thank you. Well, if you wouldn't mind taking on notice a bit more specificity around those dates. Do you know whether the facility will require new legislation?
We don't think so, Senator,
Okay, great.
but we will have to check.
Sure. Now, in terms of the eligibility criteria and the governance arrangements, who will you be engaging to advise you on that?
We're at the moment thinking about eligibility criteria, as I said to Senator Canavan just before. We have a process at the moment of engaging a firm to help us, especially on the financial criteria, but as well as the sort of the cost benefit, how good a project criteria.
Okay, that's what the $8.5 million line item is for?
No, that's not what the $8.5 million is for.
Oh,
that's
right.
actually for assessing proposals when they've come in, Senator.
Oh, I see. So is there a separate line item for the expert advice?
No, Senator.
So did you say you were, pardon me, I'm having trouble hearing, did you say you were getting that from a firm?
Yes, we are, Senator. We're having a process of bringing on board a firm to help us with the eligibility criteria.
Okay, but there's not a line item for that? Does that sit under some other?
We have no other money for that, Senator. There's no money in the measure for doing that.
So in other words, it's coming out of the Treasury's appropriation.
It's coming out of General Consolidated. Okay, thank you. So you're engaging a private firm to do to help you work on the eligibility criteria. Are you anticipating that Infrastructure Australia or the Department of Infrastructure will have any input into the setting of those eligibility criteria?
Most likely, Senator. We've already talked to the Department of Infrastructure a number of times about the facility and including on the eligibility criteria.
Okay. So I'm just trying to understand the division of labour between the private firm, the Department, Infrastructure Australia and your department.
So the eligibility criteria will be ultimately a product of the Treasury and ultimately ticked off by ministers. So we're responsible for it. We're basically engaging a firm and consulting with others around government who have an interest in around the government who have an interest in the eligibility criteria. What we're putting together, Senator, is a draft eligibility criteria, which will then go for consultation.
Okay. Thank you. Now, I've got some questions about the two line items. One appears to relate to the concessional component of the loans that are proposed to be offered under the facility. And am I correct in that you've booked the concessional component of the loans over the life of the loan in the year that the loan has been issued?
I think that's right, Senator. You're looking in Budget Paper 2.
Hope so. If you can just double check that I'm on the right track
Yes,
with that.
so-
And then can you just let me know how you worked out how much the concessional component would be?
In my layman's term, Senator, there's a difference between a rate at which a proponent of a proposal could borrow and the rate that we would lend to it through this facility. And there's a net present value of that calculation that's taken to calculate the concession, and that's put in upfront as the cost. And
So you've basically estimated how much of an interest rate difference you would offer, and that's the amount of that
Yes.
gap. Okay, thank you. Have you assumed in those figures that the full $5 billion would be distributed in the 3 years that it's been budgeted for when you've calculated that concessional component line item?
No, Senator. It goes beyond the forward estimates.
Obviously the projects will take longer than 3
I
years,
understand,
but
but
the
yes.
subscription of
Yep,
the $5
no,
billion?
it goes beyond the forward estimates.
Okay, so does that mean there's likely to be more concessional component costs beyond the forward estimates as well?
Yes, Senator.
Okay, thank you. So can you just explain to me the difference between the 793.9 figure, which I thought was the concessional component, and the 138 million, which is referred to as reflecting the cost of government borrowing? I don't understand the difference between those two
So
figures.
the measure in here is in fiscal balance terms, Senator, so in accrual terms. So in accrual numbers, we record the value of the concession up front, as those numbers show. Mm-hmm. In underlying cash balance terms, and fiscal balance in here, this is about the cost of borrowing and the cost that borrowing has on financing this. So when we give out a loan, we give out some money to a proponent. The government therefore has to borrow to give that money to the to the proposal proponent, and this effectively is the cost of our borrowing at whatever the government interest rate is at the time, is $138 million over the forward estimates.
Okay. Is that something that you usually have as a separate line item? Because that seemed to be a change of practice, but, about
I think
your...
it's been mentioned a few times in relation to concessional loans in the measures.
So the general rule is no, it's not a separate line item. Yeah. But where things are done for balance sheet purposes or where it's a financial transaction, then the normal practice is to include it.
Okay, thank you for that explanation. So have you worked out yet what level of discount, effectively, you're proposing to give?
So, as I mentioned to Senator Canavan, we've got a website up as of this morning that deals with this issue a little bit. So the basic idea is that the facility is planned not to make a profit or a loss for the government. Mm-hmm. It's basically to recoup our costs of borrowings over the life of the facility. So more or less...
Unspecified?
So it'll depend on how long people want loans from us and those sorts of things. Whether we have maximum loan terms or something will be an issue we'll think about in the eligibility criteria. But it could also depend on the proponent. They might want longer or shorter loans.
Yeah, okay.
And so the idea roughly is that we will make back the cost of our borrowings over the life of that facility.
In interest payments by the people that you've loaned to?
So more or less that the interest payments we make on money that we borrowed will be equalled by money that we get back from a person who took a loan from us.
Okay, so it'll be revenue neutral over the life of the thing. All right, thank you. Just putting that in comparison with the Clean Energy Finance Corporation that we just heard from, given that they're actually making money for government.
Yes.
I don't really know what the question is here, but the rate of return is obviously looking really good for them, and you're after a revenue neutral rate of return over an unspecified amount of time. That seems to be a much riskier investment of taxpayer dollars than the guaranteed revenue positive activities of the CEFC. Have you advised around the risk component there?
So the purpose of the two schemes is different, Senator. So the CEFC has a mandate that is effectively not to provide concessional lending, more or less. The purpose of this is to provide concessional lending. It's completely different. I mean, this fits in with the government's whole infrastructure agenda. So we have grants, and now we have concessional loans, which are sort of building on the WestConnex sort of model of giving a concessional loan as part of WestConnex building. So the idea here is actually to lend at a concessional rate, which is different to the CEFC, but also to get our money back. So one of the major bits of the criteria is to lend to things that have an income stream that we can get our money back and can pay interest and principal back.
So who will do the modelling for that? Because I was asking earlier about macro and how on earth they're proposing that they'll still be making $150 billion out of new coal and gas revenue by 2030. presumably the viability of some of the projects that the facility will be considering is coal and gas and other infrastructure. From whom will you seek advice about the long-term viability of those projects?
So, as you mentioned before, Senator, we're getting $8.5 million exactly to assess those things against the eligibility criteria that we come up with. Okay. And as we said, it'll be a detailed analysis of the financial viability of the things we're lending to.
Thank you. In terms of the cost-benefit analysis that you've mentioned a few times, will you use Infrastructure Australia's guidelines?
So, as I said, we're doing our eligibility criteria. We know that the government has a position on when to use Infrastructure Australia in looking at when it's investing in infrastructure. Mm-hmm. So we'll look through that and reflect it in our guidelines as well when we do it.
Okay, sorry, is that a yes, you'll use them, or you'll consider them, or no, you won't?
So we'll go and look at what the government's position on using Infrastructure Australia is and when it uses it, when it's investing in infrastructure, and we'll reflect that in our guidelines. Okay,
so I don't know the answer to that either. Do you know that now, when the government decides to use that cost-benefit process?
So my understanding is if there's $100 million being invested by the government,
they've said they'll require a cost-benefit analysis.
Use Infrastructure Australia. So we're just looking at how that reflects in a concessional loan facility as part of looking at the criteria. All right,
so your intention then is that you will comply with that earlier commitment to employ the Infrastructure Australia cost-benefit guidelines for projects over that amount?
So ultimately it's a government decision, but as I said, we're looking at the question.
Okay, thank you. Will those cost-benefit analyses be made public?
Don't know, Senator. We haven't gotten that far yet.
Okay. And I understand that in the Infrastructure Australia audit, which is obviously linked to this facility loosely in ways that I've established earlier this week, that that audit was underpinned by something called the 2030 Vision for Developing Northern Australia, which included various objectives. One of those objectives was what I mentioned earlier, that coal and gas exports would be up to 150 billion by 2030. Will you be reflecting the objectives of that vision document in your eligibility criteria?
I don't think we'll be reflecting that in our eligibility criteria, Senator. I think we'll be saying something along the lines of there has been an audit, it's identified a number of projects. It doesn't mean that those projects would be suitable for our facility necessarily for a number of reasons, including whether they have a financial return. I don't think we'll also be constrained to having the projects in the audit be the universe of projects that we consider either, so we don't have things outside of that.
Okay, thank you. I'm conscious that I'm running out of time and I'm almost finished. Thank you, Chair. Just in terms of ability to access the facility, will there be any sort of means test or asset test?
So this is, you mean for proponents, Senator?
Yeah,
is it?
Proponents to be able to seek cheaper loans.
This is for major projects. So as I said before, we're probably looking at loans at least in the hundreds of millions of dollars. I don't think we've thought about the question of a means test on proponents. I mean, we're trying to fit in this space of things that are close to commercial because they're the sorts of things that would be able to pay us back, but also not things that are actually commercial and the private sector would too. So it's additional. Anyway. It's trying to get additional infrastructure as opposed to infrastructure that might already be built.
Sure. Well, I guess that's the genesis and the source of my question. How will you establish what's genuinely additional? Will you just take the company's word for it that, oh no, we weren't going to do this anyway, give us some cheap money? How will you establish whether or not it was going to proceed according to market conditions without government stepping in?
So that will be part of our analysis of projects that come forward to us, because it will be part of the eligibility criteria. So the proponent of a project and whoever we engage to help us assess that will have to come to views about whether it was going to be done without assistance from the facility. Okay.
And with my final question, can I just ask which, if any, companies have already contacted you in your capacity as the point person on this new facility, expressing interest, including whether that's Adani or Hancock Prospecting or even our friends at the Institute of Public Affairs?
Senator.
No. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Chair.
Thank you very much. And